So, Kelly, we both saw Little Women this week, and we're here to talk about it now.
Yeah.
So tell me your thoughts.
I would just say, just to start, I'll give my verdict away at the very beginning. I loved it. I loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it. I thought, I mean, I've seen a lot of versions of Little Women. I told you this before, like, I'm a big fan of Little Women. Joe is one of my personal heroes. Yeah. And so I've seen so many versions of it, and I have to say this is by far my favorite. I mean, Greta Gerwig's storytelling style is really different. You do have to know the story a little bit because she jumps of between their childhood and modern, and so it's you really have to know the story. But I think that was part of what was wonderful about it, is she just kind of assumes, like, you've heard this story before. I'm not going to pretend you haven't.
Yeah, it's one of the most retold American stories.
Yeah, yeah. So I liked that she kind of assumed you already were familiar with the story and the characters, and she really dove deep into the character development. And I have to say, the reason I love it is the ending, which I don't want to give away to anybody, because she does change it a little, and there's this very interesting, like, at the end that just kind of turns the whole story on its head. And
I also loved that. But I know that we have a very different perspective on this, because I did not like it as much. So, and it's not because it wasn't good, which I think it was a really good movie. I think I've just never really felt super connected to Little Women as a story. Just because I think I've always liked the more, like, flawed characters, and this one felt very schmaltzy to me.
interesting.
But, and I mean, the story always just felt like very, you know, they're almost too selfless and too, like, good, and, you know, I know that sounds, I sound like a Scrooge, but, like, that's just always been kind of my, my issue with it. But I thought this was my favorite rendition of the movie. And there were some things that I think overall I'm still a little disconnected from the story, but there were parts of it that I liked so much that it kind of made up for a lot of that.
Yeah, so tell me more about that. What were the parts that really stuck out to you?
So things that I really loved were, I actually thought her idea of doing this, like, back and forth in time thing was really cool. And it worked specifically because of Joe kind of changing her story along the way to suit the publisher's narrative and what the publisher wanted. And so it worked where you're seeing this develop throughout the story, and you're like, oh, I wonder if this is still part of her story, and that was really cool. I also really liked Amy's character. I think this was my favorite Amy I've ever seen.
Me too. I think far and away my favorite Amy.
Yeah. And I think she really, like, changed that character in a way that I loved. And I liked seeing I liked that scene where she explains the economic motivations behind marriage and really presents, like, a great argument for why it is an economic proposition for women at that time. And so I think those were the biggest things that stuck out to me. I think a drawback of that switching back and forth in time was that it got a little confusing, since it was the same characters and they didn't look that much different. There was, you know, only one part where, like, one of the characters has slightly different hair, but for the most part, you're, like, a little confused for half of it.
Yeah, and but honestly, I thought that was part of what was interesting about it, was, you know, that they didn't have, I thought it was cool that they didn't have a cast of young girls and then older women, which is what a lot of Little Women stories do, or at least especially with, like, Amy and Beth. They're little kids and then they grow up.
Yeah, and I'm glad that they didn't waste this fantastic talent.
And I thought it was interesting because, I mean, I think, you know, true to the book, they would have been a little bit younger. Yeah. But at the same time, I think it was showing something about that time, is, like, women would have been at home until they got married, and the fact that, like, Jo went out and got a job on her own, like, was different. You know, and so I kind of liked that it was almost like, are they kids or are they grown? because in this era they would have been grown women living at home until, you know, they were all spoken for, you know, and so I thought that was really interesting, actually, a part of the storytelling, and yeah, and not, you know, wasting Florence Pugh's remarkable talents.
Right,
and I just liked how she did a lot of that with the acting, with, you know, being a lot poutier, and when she's supposed to be younger, and being
it was very clear that she was supposed to be young. It was just hard to imagine her being much younger than like 16 at that time, and she's clearly supposed to be younger than that, but it's hard because, you know, she clearly is a 20-something-year-old actor.
And I think one of the things that I liked, when I've been describing it to some folks, I've compared it to the Colin Firth version of Pride and Prejudice, and the more recent one with Keira Knightley and Matthew McFadden.
Both of which I love.
Both of which are great, but they're great in very different ways.
Yeah,
and one of the things that I liked about that version of Pride and Prejudice is I think it showed, you know, actually a family of that level of income and all of that kind of stuff would have been considered kind of like a fallen branch of a wealthier portion of the family, and so there's a point where some of the characters, which you know, in other versions of Pride and Prejudice you've seen in, you know, beautiful ball gowns and all this stuff, and they're out slopping the pigs in crummy dresses, and I like that, like looking at like, no, actually this is what this person's life would have looked like, and I feel like Greta Gerwig did that in this version of Little Women, because I loved, like, the house was like a trashed out pit sometimes, you know, which spoke to like Marmee is kind of there, but she's not, but she's volunteering all the time. She doesn't have time to clean her house because she's out doing things, and so I liked that.
That's interesting because I actually found that part kind of difficult to reconcile because I don't think I know that much about 1800s wealth. So like them complaining about not being wealthy and then having like a live-in cook maid and like living across the street from like the richest family in the area. I was like, wait, how poor are they actually poor? Like what's the deal?
And I think older versions, like they've looked as posh as Laurie's family, you know? And so that's, there was complaint, in every version they complain that they're poor. But it's harder to reconcile that in other versions where they still have nice dresses and they still, you know, and so and their house is still pristine and all of those things.
Yeah, so this one did make a more significant
you could
difference.
See the poverty. It was subtle, but you know, in every version, Aunt March is walking around being like, your mother married your father and she made a terrible mistake because of all the economic difficulties.
Speaking of Aunt March, one of my favorite characters.
Oh my gosh, right? And Meryl Streep just like,
she was so good.
She was like ready to clutch her pearls the whole time, which was wonderful. But yeah, it's just, I feel like the way the characters were portrayed and the house, and the house looked a little shabby from the outside and those kinds of things that were very, very subtle, but I think gave a lot more credence to Aunt March saying like, your branch of the family has fallen and all that kind of stuff, which I thought was a really interesting part of the retelling. Just visually, it visually spoke to a difference from other versions, which I thought was cool.
So anything that you didn't like about it?
What didn't I like?
Tough question.
Oh gosh, that's a really tough one actually. I mean, I would say the jumping between periods, it really relied on you knowing the story, which as somebody who is really familiar with the story was fine for me. But I have spoken to a lot of folks like you who don't know the story and didn't read it 20 times as a child, you know, and who found it a lot harder to follow. So I do think, you know, she relied on people knowing the story, but maybe a little too much. And I definitely see how that, because even I, at a few points, was kind of like, wait, is this before or after Beth died? And wait, what? So there were some moments where, like, even someone as familiar with the story as I am got a little lost. And so I think there could have been other things she did for clarity somehow, like, you know, the different dress in each era, you know, something.
Right. That's what I was thinking. Something about the costume changes, which, by the way, I loved the costumes. They were fantastic. But yeah, I think I mean, I really appreciate how bold of a choice that was, though. So, you know, overall, I think that was a good choice, even though it gets a little bit confusing at points.
Yeah, and I think like even the things that I thought I didn't like during watching it, afterwards I kind of pieced together like, oh, she did that because of this. Like, oh, that's really interesting. So, for example, in a lot of versions of Little Women, Frederick Bear, the man that Jo ultimately marries, I don't think I'm giving that spoiler away to anybody.
No, yeah.
They build his character up and up and up, and you know, and they build the romantic chemistry. And in this one,
there was
no
no
I sat there
build
going,
up.
when are we going to talk to Professor Bear? When is Professor Bear coming in? Like, and I was just waiting. And then again, I don't want to give away how she twisted the ending, but once I saw the end, I was like, oh, that's why. That's a great choice. That's a great choice.
Yeah. I think on that same line, something I did have a little bit of a problem with was that Meg and her relationship wasn't developed very well.
Yeah.
Even though she's supposed to kind of serve as the foil to Jo's like very independent lifestyle, and Meg is supposed to be the one who's like, hey, it's also okay for me to have my own desires, which are domestic. And you don't really get to see the buildup of her relationship with, which I think could have been really nice. But I know they had only a limited amount of time, and they had a lot of sisters to focus on. So,
well, and I even thought if it's being told, because I had the same thought. I was like, where that like romance came out of nowhere. But my thought was, you know, it's really only the moments that Jo sees, because it's like, you know, this version more than any other is like very clearly like, this is Jo's book. It's not Little Women, this is Jo's book. And so I thought it was an interesting choice in that like she didn't really see it, because we see her begging Meg not to get married. Because it's clear that Jo doesn't understand. She doesn't understand the draw, she doesn't understand the appeal. And I think if we'd seen more of the development of that relationship,
it wouldn't be as much Jo's book.
Jerk, you know, like first off. But yeah, so I agree with you. I didn't like that they didn't build that up, but I thought the moments they did show were so cute and poignant, and you know.
And I think their argument about like you mentioned, Jo, you know, being a jerk by saying like, don't do it, but at the same time, But I thought that was such a good sisterly moment of like, Jo just clearly doesn't understand she doesn't want the same things, and that ended up being okay. Like, and I think that was a really good part of this, is that it is showing all these different ways to be a woman, which is very nice to have this many options, which is the whole goal. Totally.
And I thought Laura Dern was the best Marmee I've ever seen. So
she was so good.
She was, oh my gosh, she's wonderful. So that's the last thing I'll say is Laura Dern as Marmee just made my world. I loved her so much in that role. She was the most complex Marmee I think I've seen, you know, like she's very introspective and like clearly fighting her own demons by raising her girls. And that, you know, again,
there was a really interesting scene with her where I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't seen this much of a complex version before.
Yeah, and as a mom myself, it was just, she was so much more relatable than other Marmies who have just been like 100% like, everything is wonderful and I love my girls. You know, which, you know, is lovely, but it was nice to see a complicated Marmee who was a woman in her own right, like trying to figure life out. And I thought that was a really nice choice to see Marmee as not just a mom, but as a person.
Yeah. So I think the last thing that I'll say is just the one thing overall that I think just bothers me about the story is it just felt like a lot of the conflicts between the sisters, I really, really wanted those and I really liked them. And I just felt like they got kind of, it was like, oh, everything's okay. And there was one that I thought was so strong, and I was really excited to see the fallout from it. And it just kind of went in this predictable path that I was like, I'm a little disappointed by that. And I felt like that for a lot of the conflicts between Jo and Amy, which I thought could have, like, they brought them more to the surface, but I thought they could have just had a little bit more, like, punch to them, because this is a story about sisters, and sisters can be very cruel to one another, and they can also love each other and have so much affection at the end of the day. Yeah. And you know, I saw it a little bit, but I just wish there was more of it.
Yeah, a little more dynamics.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, totally.
But otherwise, I think, you know, the more I think about it, it's like each individual piece I really liked. It's just, for me overall, I think I've always just felt that the story is just too sweet for me. And I think if you like Little Women and you love the story and you love the characters, you're gonna love this so much. Yeah. And if you're going in thinking that maybe it's not gonna do it for you, you might be right.
Yeah. It's just, I would say, like, Greta Gerwig, this was probably the best retelling. So if you're gonna like Little Women, this is the version you're gonna like, I think. So yeah, no, it's wonderful, and we're playing it for another week, so people have another chance to come out. So
yeah, and even as somebody who like isn't the biggest fan, I still would go see it again. I still liked it. I didn't feel like I wasted my time. It was still a good movie, and it's a great holiday movie. It made me feel really good. Totally. So, you know, no loss. I just wanted to present my little, you know, opposing opinion here, but because we usually agree on everything. So,
well, next week we'll be reviewing Knives Out, and
we'll see how we feel about that.
Well,
well, thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you, Phoebe,
and thanks for watching.